Well, I'm Cynthia Caboo, and I want to welcome you very much to this project. This is a project that has been in the making for quite a while and was interrupted by COVID, but we are here now, and we're so thrilled to see all of you. As we move on with the slides, I'm a neuropsychologist who works at the Cleveland Clinic, and I'm also a professor of neurology at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine of Case Western Reserve University in the School of Medicine. It's really my true privilege to introduce you to this project, Dementia and Personhood, Facts and Myths. This project is it's possible only due to generous funding from the Ohio Humanities Council and support from the Cleveland Clinic Center for Neurological Restoration, which is a designated Parkinson's Disease Center of Excellence, as well as a Huntington's Disease Center of Excellence. I want to mention the collaborators on this project, in particular, a big shout out to Aaron Lamb. These are individuals who are experts in the humanities: Aaron Lamb, Eileen Anderson, Mark Alicio, Jess Ballinger, Paul Ford, and Lauren Sankry. In addition, I want to acknowledge the individuals listed on this slide. These are volunteers who are going to help facilitate our small group discussions, and they're outstanding individuals. I've had the chance to meet and chat with them as well. So the most important, though, people are you, as well as this couple who were kind enough to share their story of dementia with our team. And it is because of individuals such as them that this project exists. And what is really the motivating factor, I think, for all of us is to listen to stories of dementia from those who are living with it. So the goal of our project is really to promote less stigmatized understandings of dementia. Our cultural representations of dementia do not accurately reflect all patients' and families' lived experiences. And this project hopes to give voice to such real-life experiences and engage the public in comparing these stories to their and our own presumptions. The impetus behind this really stemmed out of my clinical work. In my clinical work, I often see patients who are concerned about changes in their thinking, including early stage dementia. Many of these patients and their families are afraid, and they're afraid because of the stories they have heard about dementia. The goal of this project is to try to address some of those potential fears by learning more about what dementia is and how our ideas about dementia are influenced by larger cultural factors. So we partnered with experts in the medical humanities, ethics, philosophy, history, and anthropology to critically examine and challenge our understanding of dementia and those who live with it. We hope that this project empowers more people with dementia and their families to share their stories so we can reduce some of the fear and stigma associated with the diagnosis. That does not mean to say that we think this is always rosy and optimistic, because as with every illness, there's elements of bittersweetness, right? But it is to say that I think it's important that we have a broader and more complex and nuanced understanding of dementia and the stories that reflect patients' experiences so that we can reduce some of that fear. So that is our goal. Our program includes, now we're going to be moving to sharing our patient's story, followed by very brief TED Talks, if you will, or mini talks by the experts I listed in my collaborators. The patient story and these talks will be available on the website where you registered for later viewing, if that's what you would like. And after the brief presentations, everyone will be placed in small breakout group discussions for more in-depth discussion. Those conversations in the small group will not be recorded. And then we will conclude by coming together and sharing the talking points and what we shared in the small group discussions, and moving forward that way. So what I want to do now is really take the focus off me, because I'm the least important person here, and on our patient's story now. Thank you.
Not being able to remember names and nouns were the two things that were the first to go. I'd be in the middle of a sentence and I couldn't finish it.
The official diagnosis of Alzheimer's coincided pretty closely with the beginning of COVID.
In a sense, I was relieved because it gave it a name, but it was also a little disconcerting and a little scary. I started telling friends, I said, love me or leave me. I mean, this is who I am. So many people say, you don't have Alzheimer's, because most of the time I can carry on a pretty coherent conversation.
In many people's minds, the word Alzheimer's means, oh, this is, really awful. And it isn't.
Yes.
It isn't really awful.
I feel as if I'm two-sided. There's the part of me that's normal and doing fine, and there's the part of me that's normal but not doing so fine.
It is impacting our lives more, but the increase is so gradual that we'll adjust to it, and then we'll fall behind in our adjustment and then learn to catch up and adjust more.
One of the things that's different is that Quentin gets more irritable when I do things that are wacky, or if I ask the same question 3 times in a row. The nice thing is that when he gets really irritable, we end up in a nice big hug. So that feels good.
There is still so much love, but it takes on new aspects in order to work with the current reality. And I love growing into that. And it is a growth process.
Yeah. There are things that we share that are really essential to each of us individually and as a couple, and that is our love of music. Every day we go for a walk, and I love those. I think it's fair to say that we both love the walks.
And for as long as we can, we'll go to Maine for almost half the year, and that's a great joy.
What hasn't changed? I still love music. I still love my husband. I'm so aware of my having Alzheimer's. It is so much a part of me. It's something that I just live with, and it's who I am. In one sense, I hate Alzheimer's. In another sense, it's given me gifts. I've always had a certain element of me that is self-critical, and I still am sometimes. I get annoyed at myself, but I'm adapting to it, and I'm accepting of it, and accepting of me. And I think that's new and different, and I appreciate that.
Wonderful. So that's just another person's view of what their life is like within the diagnosis of dementia. What we're going to move on to now is some of the short talks, and I'm going to start out by telling us what dementia is. As I mentioned in the introduction for this project, I'm a neuropsychologist at the Cleveland Clinic and work with patients with brain-based or neurological disorders. And so what is neuropsychology? Neuropsychology is the study of the brain and behavior. And we know that different parts of the brain are important for different kinds of behaviors, such as vision, memory, planning, and judgment. And neuropsychologists have developed tests that measure these different thinking skills. And we can plot scores on a graph like this to identify an individual's strengths and their weaknesses. And we can see on this crude graph that attention and problem solving are average for this patient, and construction is above average. But language and memory are relatively low and below average. And so we look at a person's pattern of test scores across several different cognitive domains and behaviors to infer which parts or what parts of the brain may not be functioning in a healthy way. This pattern suggests that regions near the patient's left temporal lobe may not be functioning normally. So what is dementia then? Dementia is a new substantial impairment in one or more aspect of thinking. These are cognitive changes that interfere with independence in everyday activities. So it's not just something you see on a test, it's something that you observe day in, day out in everyday function. And it's diagnosed by history, careful clinical interview to rule out other things that may be causing problems that are reversible, and testing that may include cognitive tests, brain scans, and lab work. So Alzheimer's disease is one type of dementia, and it's the most common type of dementia and classically defined by significant memory impairments early in the course. The memory impairments are characterized by difficulties remembering new information, like a conversation that you had earlier in the day, whereas information from much later in your history, you tend to hold on to a little bit better. Other disorders can result in dementia as well, such as Parkinson's disease, Lewy body disease, frontotemporal dementia, and strokes or cerebrovascular disease. Different dementias had different patterns of cognitive strengths and weaknesses depending on the brain regions involved. Furthermore, the pattern of cognitive strengths and weaknesses associated with these diseases may look very different from Alzheimer's disease. Most dementias, not all, but most, begin with very subtle, mild symptoms, and it may take several years before symptoms become more severe, and some patients may never demonstrate the severe symptoms. So what have I learned then about dementia and living with dementia from my patients? I've learned many, many, many things, but I'm only going to share a few lessons now. One, that change is part of life, and it happens with aging. Two, change can be scary. Three, life is a team sport, and there is no shame in relying on your team, particularly when you have given and continue to give so much to everyone else. And finally, a diagnosis of dementia doesn't mean that all thinking skills are impaired, that life stops, or there is no joy. And that's why I pursued this project. I want to hear patients' stories and experiences so I can do a better job helping my future patients and their families. It is the patients who are largely absent from this discussion, and yet those are the voices that matter most to me and to all of us involved in this project. We, healthcare professionals, families, the general public, need to hear from you. Thank you.
So greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Erin Lamb from Case Western Reserve University, and I'm interested in how the stories that we encounter in our popular media affect how we think about health. The word dementia is not a neutral word. It triggers associations that come from our personal experiences, but that also come from our culture, particularly from the popular media that we consume. As Americans, we're often exposed to many of the same media or cultural sources, and thus we tend to have similar understandings of what dementia is, what we might call the dementia imaginary. I'll suggest that there are three main ideas that form the American dementia imaginary. First, understanding dementia through the biomedical model, then representing dementia as a personal and family tragedy, and perceiving dementia as a growing crisis. So what I mean by the biomedical model is that we first and foremost think of dementia as disease. So to address dementia, we seek medical diagnosis and medical treatments, particularly pharmaceuticals. And this model suggests that national funds earmarked for dementia should be spent on understanding the biology of the disease and on seeking a medical cure. Typically, this model presents dementia and dementia caregiving as universally negative experiences. Along those same lines is the idea that dementia is a personal and family tragedy. In Hollywood's standard storylines, dementia is almost always Alzheimer's type. It almost always happens to people who are white and middle class, and it's typically portrayed by shifting back and forth from the past to the present in order to show all that has been lost due to dementia. We commonly talk about dementia as something that steadily exterminates the person as a person, causing a loss of the self, or we describe a person with dementia as already gone or dying when they are still alive. A third piece of the American dementia imaginary is the idea that dementia is a growing epidemic that we must all work to prevent or else suffer through. And to prevent this crisis, we're told that we should maintain our brain health by keeping our brains active or by taking unproven supplements. The responsibility for preventing dementia is thus placed on the individual. So the dementia imaginary matters because it shapes how we interact with people with dementia and how we understand what it means to receive a dementia diagnosis. But what if American culture told us different stories about dementia? Rather than telling each individual to exercise their brain, we might focus on improving brain health for all by building healthier, more equitable environments. Rather than portraying dementia only as loss, we might instead represent it as change, an adaptation. And above all, we might start listening to stories from people who live with dementia. Organizations like Dementia Alliance International and Dementia Action Alliance are dedicated to promoting the voices of people with dementia. We should be elevating the complex and nuanced stories of real individuals that can challenge Hollywood's scripts and better reflect the diverse experiences of people with dementia. What we need to keep in mind is that the dementia imaginary is not fixed. It's something that can change, and all of us can help to change it by the stories we choose to share. By changing the dementia imaginary, we can make dementia diagnosis less tragic and more empowering. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jess Ballinger. I'm a historian of medicine at Drexel University, and I've written about the history of Alzheimer's disease. As a historian of dementia, I find it humbling to speak to an audience of people with dementia, their families and caregivers. What can history offer to people who are dealing with such a monumental challenge? As a historian, I can't offer comforting news about scientific progress or practical advice for managing the many day-to-day issues that this condition creates. What I can bring as a historian is a critical perspective to the typical messages about dementia that permeate our society, such as those Dr. Lamb just talked about. History can help us understand where our ideas about dementia came from and how the experience of dementia is shaped by the social and cultural context in which we live. History can help us understand why we think the way we do about dementia and the consequences of those ways of thinking. And perhaps it can enlarge our sense of what is possible. Let me begin by pointing out that people haven't always thought about dementia the way we do. Scholars have noted that descriptions of mental deterioration associated with old age that today would likely be diagnosed as conditions like Alzheimer's have appeared in literary, legal, and medical texts in every society, stretching back to antiquity. But in general, these texts did not distinguish dementia from the broad array of debilitating physical and mental losses associated with growing old. The deterioration of memory and language in old age was certainly not welcome in the ancient world, but it was approached with the same sort of stoicism as any other aspect of aging. It did not generate the same kind of intense dread and anxiety that it does today. The origin of the modern fear of dementia lies in the European Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, the period from the late 17th through the early 19th century, in which a life of reason and self-fulfillment was seen as the proper aim of every individual. But the shadow side of this emphasis on cognition and self-creation was fear about its fragility and its potential erosion in old age. At risk of putting too fine a point on it, if it was true that, in the famous words of the Enlightenment philosopher René Descartes, I think, therefore I am, then it followed that if I begin to lose my ability to think, I begin to lose my very self. Perhaps the most famous and chilling example of this Enlightenment era fear was Jonathan Swift's description of the Struldbrugs in his classic satiric novel Gulliver's Travels, first published in 1726. The Struldbrugs are immortal, and when Captain Gulliver, the narrator of the book, first hears of them, he is ecstatic and eager to converse with them, thinking they must be the wisest of all men. But then he learns that their immortality was made miserable by the accumulation of all of the infirmities associated with old age. He especially dwells on their failing memory, their inability to recognize close friends and family. Gulliver concludes that no tyrant could invent a form of torturous death that he would not gladly embrace to avoid the fate of becoming a Struldbrug. This fear and loathing of dementia as a kind of living death has been a through line in ideas about dementia down to the present. In the 1980s, when advocates for Alzheimer's disease research sought to raise public awareness and support for government funding, they used harrowing descriptions of people with dementia that frequently hinged on this very idea. As Dr. Lamb pointed out in her presentation, this idea has become all too common in the news and popular culture, and it's deeply stigmatizing, representing the person with dementia as no longer really even there, despite the troubling persistence of the body. We need to get beyond such stereotypical ideas of dementia. As a historian, I would assert that as much as any other experience in life, the experience of dementia is an example of the famous phrase, "the personal is the political." While dementia will always entail grave personal losses, historical perspective asserts that dementia is a central part of the human drama, and I would even say that it is potentially a location for social transformation and regeneration. This is one reason that all of the scholars contributing to this program have, in one way or another, emphasized the importance of sharing personal stories of dementia and caregiving. In confronting the personal challenges of dementia, we may ultimately find ourselves challenging the dominance of political and social values like individualism and economic efficiency that have driven the stereotype of dementia. Meeting the challenges of dementia may require us to embrace and find new value in vulnerability, interdependence, and the common good. Such values may help us not only meet the challenge of dementia, but the broad range of social, economic, and environmental challenges facing humanity. You are not alone. More than that, you are needed. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eileen Anderson from the Department of Bioethics at Case Western Reserve University. Thank you to Drs. Kaboo and Lamb for putting this together, and thanks to each of you for being with us today. I'm a psychological and medical anthropologist who also studies neuroscience. What anthropology brings to us is an understanding of the impact of culture on human health and well-being. Culture includes ideas and behaviors shared by a social group. That's important because when we look at issues all humans have to face, like birth and death, cultures handle them differently. They have different beliefs and behaviors that they think will best help. This is also true in medical care. Whether it's promoting health or dealing with a problem like depression, cancer, or even COVID, different cultures treat prevention and intervention in many ways, and outcomes are not always better in richer countries. In the case of dementia, as people are living longer around the world, more cultures face how to think about it and handle it. For example, in Belize, Central America, where I've worked for 26 years, the current generation is living longer than ever before. There are also more reports of dementia than ever before. But the culture is set up differently, where elders are valued not for what they do, but for who they are. Cognitive change doesn't impact who the person is in a family, and there is a lot of intergenerational care. The outcomes are pretty good. There is also attention to joy in the senses, good food and music from earlier times, a cool ocean breeze, and smiles and touch such as holding hands. There are lots of ways to enjoy life, even when cognitive function declines. In our American culture, we see a lot of differences too. For example, African Americans and Latinos have higher rates of dementia than whites, yet they have lower engagement with medical care for many reasons. More of their care is done in families and communities. How can we come up with innovative ways to support these non-medical caregiving models? How can medicine better support families and communities providing care? In the longer talk, I give more examples and explanations, but the bottom line is, if we have so much human diversity, why should one size fit all? Why should we only have one way to think about dementia and one way to treat it? It's time to learn from many cultures to continue to expand our toolbox for living as well as possible with dementia. Thank you.
I'm Mark Alicio from CWRU and Metro Health. My doctorate's in philosophy, so I'm going to address some philosophical questions about dementia in light of my grandma's story. I'm going to highlight the traditional concept of personal identity, a concept that is threatened by dementia, and share my perspective on grandma's life, her final years living with dementia, and what this might mean for personal identity. What is a person? What makes this person Mark and not some other person? How do specific persons persist through time? The common feature spanning over 2,000 years is rationality. That humans are intelligent, able to think, reason, and reflect is supposed to be constitutive of persons. Traditionally, personal identity, then, has been defined in terms of cognitive abilities like rationality, consciousness, memory, and psychological continuity. Dementia threatens this. My grandma's life and her final years living with dementia have made me think differently about myself, personal identity, and even personhood. Einstein once asked Freud what matters, to which Freud responded, love and work, work and love, that's all there is. Grandma had more than her share of work and a whole lot of love. Adele Yersick was born to Polish immigrants in Uniontown, PA in 1923. At just 25 years old and already a mother of 5, she lost her husband Anthony in a railroad accident. Grandma then moved to Elyria to be near her 3 sisters, taking a job as a cashier at a grocery store. Her faith sustained her through the death of her husband, her daughter Teresa's traumatic brain injury, and when she would welcome her younger sister Anne into her house as she fled a difficult marriage. On Grandma's 39th birthday and my parents' wedding day, Uncle Tony was paralyzed playing high school football. Grandma would take care of Uncle Tony until he died 46 years later. More tragedy, more work, but also more love. Over time, Ann and Grandma both developed dementia. As Ann's dementia progressed, she also seemed to become more troubled, burdened with crying fits and deepening depression. Her story more closely resembles what our culture tells us dementia is. Grandma went down a different path. It was a path mostly of affability, contentedness, and apparent happiness in the moment. My last memories of Grandma are of her playing with baby dolls and coloring. She was happy, especially when she would see one of her great-grandkids, commenting on their hair or clothes or youthfulness. She seemed to love each baby doll, each great-grandchild, living each moment only in the present. By then, there was no apparent rationality, only present consciousness, and no memory or continuity of experience. Yet there she was, happy, as if in love. The traditional concept of personal identity is hypercognitive, but this is only a part of who we are. Change to personal identity is constant. Poets know this, and they also know that aging and even dementia is not all bad. I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now. Patients who suffer limb loss or even paralysis, like my Uncle Tony, hope for restoration of function, but even more so, they long for restoration of touch, of sensation. It's the human touch, that sense of connectedness, to love and be loved, that we most long for. Maybe we should think of love as at the center of personal identity, of personhood. Maybe love is what holds us together. And maybe, in the end, if we're lucky, love is all we have left, and maybe it really is all we need.
So what powerful story to start our session off with, that video of the couple thriving, and now with Professor Alicio's description of his grandmother. My name is Paul Ford, and I'm a clinical ethicist at the Cleveland Clinic. Over the past 20 years, I've spoken to thousands of patients and family members struggling with tough medical choices. Many of those choices were for people with dementia or other progressive illnesses. Sometimes I reassure people of a clear choice they make. Other times I help them reframe their decision-making based on changed medical circumstances. Most medical ethics choices come during later stages of dementia, when loved ones struggle to know how to respond to those changing medical circumstances. You can hear those struggles vividly as people grapple with how to respond to the situations that change. A daughter looks at her mother with a baby doll and blurts out, "This is so undignified. She was a proud woman." At the same time, that daughter is also struck by how contented and peaceful the doll makes her mother look. It gives peace and solace. So there's common value assertions that can be troubling, particularly in those later stages. This is when a clinical ethicist may be asked to help people living with dementia and their loved ones our first gut responses need to be to reconsider how these new circumstances should change things. So a tough ethical choice always means that we sacrifice one important thing. It's something that's of value to preserve another of value. It's not always intuitive. Our gut responses often lead us astray when we encounter new circumstances. We're pulled to follow our old habits that work well in usual situations, but these are now unusual situations. We need to step back and consider the perspective of the person who is living with the dementia. Dignity is not always anchored, dignity is always anchored in the person's own perception and within societal attitudes. So we need to ask, what is this person's current experience? Do we need to change the person's circumstances? Or is it society that needs to change to accommodate for these differences? The most important question remains, is this person being cared for in the way they want and need? It is from the perspective and experience of that person of what is dignified, not some past experiences. So, dementia in its later stages presents counterintuitive challenges that really can be troubling as the dementia progresses. And advancing dementia does not keep people from and their loved ones from lives that are rich. The focus needs to be shifting goals of caring. And I think we saw this in the first video. But we really need to focus that it's important for us to provide care from the perspective of the loved one with dementia. And in order to do that, we need to pay careful attention to their current stories and experiences.
Well, as our final act here, I'm Lauren Sankry. I'm a clinical ethicist and a researcher in the Neurological Institute at the Cleveland Clinic. And in my research, I set out to better understand some of the motivations that individuals who choose to participate in Alzheimer's disease research may have. I expected when I met with research participants to hear language that might mirror some of the language used to describe Alzheimer's disease research in news outlets and academic journals, as well as some patient advocacy groups. This language so often describes a fight to end Alzheimer's disease and the suffering that it may cause. Instead, when I had conversations with research participants, I found that the decision to enroll in research did cause research participants to reflect on any biases or stigmatizing beliefs that they associated with dementia. For one participant, rather than a struggle or a fight, he saw the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as actually a good thing, and that it's a byproduct of a longer lifespan. Another participant described how his perceptions of Alzheimer's disease were informed by visiting his mother-in-law while she was in a nursing home. And he witnessed the joy that she experienced while living with dementia. And through music and dance, he shared that joy with her, and this alleviated some of the fear that he associated with developing a neurodegenerative condition himself. Rather than feeling a sense of dread about unavoidable suffering, Alzheimer's disease research participants described to me that they felt the sense of empowerment in contributing to research efforts, and they felt motivation to learn as much as they can about their own risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Learning information about the likelihood of developing this disease empowered participants to be more intentional about how they spent their time and about planning for the future. Some research participants I spoke with felt that discussing brain health helps reduce stigma associated with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. This participant expressed the desire to share information with his loved ones, his friends, anyone who is willing to listen really about the symptoms that he experienced of mild cognitive impairment to normalize dementia as no different than other health conditions we might feel more comfortable talking about, like cancer. To individuals living with dementia and their loved ones, if the language or stories you hear about Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, if that language does not fit your experience, feel free to reject language about suffering and choose words that describe your own experiences and what it means to you to live well with dementia. Thank you.